Hi, and welcome along to our latest in a series of videos about container security fundamentals. Last time we talked about the Linux network namespace, which helps isolate networking information visible to a process or a container. What we're going to do today is carry on and take a look at another one of the namespaces that might be useful to you when securing containers. So, just to remind you of what we've got, we have 8 namespaces in Linux, each of those used to isolate a different resource. There's 6 that are enabled by default, and then we have the user namespace, which is not enabled by default but can be, and it's the user namespace that we want to talk about today. It's really useful because it helps you decouple the user ID inside a process or inside a container from user IDs on the underlying host. And probably the most useful use of the user namespace is to allow you to appear to be the root user inside a container without actually giving you the privileges of the root user on the underlying host. That can be a big win for security because it means you're not running as root. So let's look at how that actually works. We've got our standard Linux host here running Docker, and it's just running Ubuntu 22.04. And what we can do is we can actually demonstrate how the user namespace works just with an ordinary process. To do this, what we're going to do is we're going to use the unshare command, which is one we've used before to create different namespaces on a host. So I've got a standard unshare command here, and we're going to give it the commands that we need to actually give it a new user namespace. And we're going to start a bash shell, as you can see here at the end of the command. Now, before I run the command, you can see that I'm an ordinary user. You can also see that I'm not running this command as root, so I'm not using sudo. And when I hit enter, you'll notice that my user on this host appears now to be the root user. So that's kind of interesting because I shouldn't be able to just instantly go from an ordinary user to the root user. So let's dig into a bit of what's going on because it kind of shows how user namespaces work. If I hit the ID command inside my process here, inside my user namespace, you can see that indeed it tells me I am UID 0 and GID 0, so I appear to be the root user. But what's actually happening on the host side? What's happening, in the wider host? I've got another shell here, and if I do psef, you can actually see down here that the unshare command, which we've just executed, is running as my ordinary user, and the bash shell is running as my ordinary user. So this is a user namespace. So as far as the host is concerned, I'm still my ordinary user. I have the privileges of my ordinary user, but as far as my shell is concerned, I'm actually running as root. We can prove this by trying to delete a file that the real root user would be allowed to, but an ordinary user wouldn't. We'll try and delete etc password. And you can see it says no, go away. So despite me being the root user, it's not allowing me to do that. And that's what is enabled us to do with a user namespace. So one of the things we can try and do is actually say, well, how does that work inside containers? So as I said, this isn't enabled by default on Docker, but it's something you can turn on. So if I do cat etc docker daemon.json, which is where you'd usually turn this on, you can see that I've actually enabled it on this install of Docker, and I'm going to do user namespace remap for the ROREM user, which is my user account on this machine. Now, if I run a container, we'll just run an Ubuntu container up, and we'll run the bash shell inside the container. What you'll see is, as expected inside the container, it actually won't give me UID, but it does let me tell my username here. So it tells me that I am the root user. So I'm the root user inside the container, but what am I on the host, right? Because we've said we're now using user namespaces, and we're remapping that root user to another UID. So if I do psef on the host again, what we can see actually down here is that we have a user ID of 100,000, which is actually running that bin bash shell inside the container. So it's remapped the root user inside my container to UID 100,000 outside on the actual host. So I get all the benefits of being root without the risks of being UID 0. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and that demonstrates a bit of how user namespaces work and how you can turn them on. One small note of caution with user namespaces is allowing users to create new user namespaces and to create new namespaces in which they're root can have some security downsides, because if there is a Linux kernel vulnerability that's only exposed to the root user, it can sometimes be exposed to the root user inside a user namespace. And there have been some examples of that in recent Linux kernel privilege escalation vulnerabilities. So that's definitely one to watch for. Hopefully that was an interesting quick look at how user namespaces work and how you might want to enable them in your container environment. Next time, we'll be pushing on and moving on to Linux capabilities, which show you another way of actually limiting the rights of the root user. So please do join us in that next video. Thanks and bye.